Can I tick-tock? Watching it on the computers. All right, it's 7 o'clock, so we will get started. I'll start off with the statement of acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge this land that we meet on today. Item number 2 is the attendance record, and I believe that everybody is here. And welcome to Councillor Shanks, who's new to the Audit Committee, and congratulations to Christine, who's had been reappointed. So welcome back. And welcome to everyone else that's here. So we don't have any apologies, no. There's no motions to grant leave of absence, no leave of absence, and no non-attendance. Okay, so item 3, do we have any declarations of interest for the agenda items? No, none noted. And item 4, are there any business arising from the minutes? No, from last time, none noted. All right, well, we'll go straight into the decision report, seeing as this is a special audit and risk committee meeting. So we haven't got the minutes from the last meeting. We'll go to the main meeting. So, the first report is the Treasury Management Report, and the Audit and Risk Committee has been asked to receive and note the update report in accordance with the discussion that was had at the last Audit and Risk Committee meeting. Do you want to talk to the report or go straight to any questions? Yep.
I'm happy to talk to the report. So I just thought it was pertinent, given the discussions that we had at our last meeting in relation to the debt management, that we present this report here. So just confirming that we have actually fixed $9 million worth of our CAD facility, and that was fixed at a rate of 5.07%. Just between the timing of our discussion at the Audit Committee and then by the time that the Council had actually endorsed the recommendation to fix that debt, the interest rates had moved slightly. So you might remember that the report was based on a fixing it for 2 years. However, the 2-year rate had risen, whereas the 3-year rate was still around the 5.07. So it's been fixed for 3 years, and realistically, the council's not going to be in a position to start paying down debt anyway. So taking advantage of that extra saving interest, even though it was only minor, but I think we took advantage of that. So we're back into ratio, and we've with regard to that, so we've actually got just over 50% of our debt is fixed, and 46% is variable now. So yeah. So I'll take any questions.
Yes, Redmond.
In the report, it says to reduce the weighted interest from 6.16% to 5.69%, but you're saying it's 5.07. Is that correct?
The rate that we actually fixed that $9 million at was 5.07, but with the fixed the credit foncier debt, which was actually at a higher rate, the average rate is 5.69 across all of our mix. So we've got 6.15, which is the variable rate, so we've got half of that, and so the weighted average cost of our interest that we're paying across all our debt, all of our debt is 5.69, so it's still 5.69. But we fixed $9 million at 5.07. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Shanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on page 6 of 21 of the report, I just picked up the same reference number. I might just be missing something there, but just it was CA 108, both convertible cash advance facility and cash advance facility there. Just trying to, and I know there's a different reference there, I just wanted a bit of clarity around that one if I could.
So in relation to CO 105, so one as part of the, and I might have to call on Erin for this, but as part of the COVID stimulus, the LGFA provided a discounted interest facility, and that's the balance of that facility after we actually converted and we fixed the $9 million. So we couldn't just fix $9 million in total. We had to actually go through our existing variable facilities and determine which ones that we were actually going to fix. And then we just transferred money, reshuffled the money from the variable facilities to those fixed facilities. So, they're, even though that they still have the same reference, they're two slightly different facilities because of the discount interest rate, and that was a special deal that LGFA did during COVID.
Just wondering if the LGFA representative has come to present to Council.
Through the Chair, yes, they came presented to the Council on the 28th of February, and that was a very good session. Probably went for about 2 hours. Very interactive.
That's good.
Are there any other questions, comments, statements? Everybody's happy with the paper? So, yeah, the recommendation is to receive and note the Treasury Management Update Report. Have I got a mover? Christine, a seconder? Peter? All in favour? Carried unanimously. All right. Now we'll move to item 5.2, which is the draft 24-25 budget. So Sharon, would you like to talk to that?
Thanks, through the Chair. So I'll take the report as read. I'll just add a few comments in relation to that, in the sense that, so back on the 19th of March, the Council considered the report and presented, I suppose, endorsed or supported in principle the draft budget with a minor adjustment, which was in relation to one capital project that was presented that was taken out following the discussions that we had in relation to that particular project. In developing the budget, Executive had the Audit Committee's recommendation to try and return or position this year's budget in a way that we could actually return to an operating surplus position for 25-26. As I, made a comment at the last Audit Committee, that is a fairly big goal, fairly, as I described it to the Council, probably a very audacious goal, but it's a target and it's a goal that, as an executive, we accepted the challenge to do that. Yes, the current position that's presented is still an operating deficit position. However, it is realistically going to be a difficult task, because the way to actually put the budget back into surplus is actually to be able to reduce or pull out of the recurrent operating budget expenditure. This budget incorporates a savings target for this year of around $750,000, which comes in from both employee expenses, which realistically the idea is that that will actually come through natural attrition as people leave. There will be that time lag between the person resigning and that 3-month recruitment process. Ideally, people will sort of sit there and say, okay, well, how come it takes you 3 months to recruit positions? So depending on where the position is, that's realistically a good recruitment. We're still struggling across the board. We still have low unemployment, and I think South Australia has the lowest unemployment across the country at 3.6%. So trying to find candidates when we actually do have vacancies, there is that time lag. Obviously, with positions that are, I suppose, business critical, those positions will be backfilled as soon as possible, either with contractors or somehow we can actually backfill those positions. In addition to that, so there's around about $475,000 as a saving target in the materials and contracts. Again, we haven't identified how that is being delivered. Need to do to actually try and identify and bring that cost base of the recurrent budget down. With regard to how we're actually going to do that, I have circulated the workshop presentations to the independent committee members, so they're sort of across the positioning that we've actually been presenting to the council. But as an executive team, we got together and we said, look, realistically, how are we going to do this? So we came up with looking at, I suppose, the rest of this council term, the next council term, and that one, the next one up thereafter, and try and break down how we're actually going to structure, I suppose, the budgets going for the remainder of this term, how we're actually going to structure the asset programs and the asset development, and what our major focus as an organisation needs to be from, I suppose, that future planning position. What we came up with was a long-term financial plan, or a diagram that sort of said, okay, well, for the remainder of this term, what we'll actually do is focus on the basics. So looking back from a actual physical spend, focus on those basics, focus on the renewal component of the asset management and what we actually need to do, and get back to those core essential services. But while at the same time, do some planning for what we actually need to do for planning from a future perspective, and where we would start implementing and doing the construction of those projects in the next council term. So that's that again, plus growth. We estimate at this current time the growth from new development will be around 2%, probably recommending that any growth over and above that 2% is actually added to that revenue base as well. We won't know that until we actually start getting the valuation information. We've got a first couple of weeks, but because of the nature of our assessment base, where we have a lot of vacant land that then needs to be converted to residential assessments, it's probably from the next couple that we will start understanding how many assessments and what that new growth figure is actually will actually be. From a capital perspective, the budget does have a recommendation for a capital program of around about $13.3 million, inclusive of capitalised salaries. That actually has a strong focus on the renewal budget. So the renewal component of that capital spend is around about $9 million. And that has the emphasis on our contribution to those interventions that were included is around, I think it's between around 10 to 15%. So we've actually budgeted for that. However, the delivery of that is actually dependent on the timing of the developer. So we may, even though we've budgeted for that $1.3 million, because obviously if the developer's ready to do those traffic interventions, we will be required to actually make our contribution. But obviously if we don't need to spend it, we won't spend it, so we won't be borrowing that money to do that. With regard to the operating initiatives, we have a net position of around about 520,000. And again, the operating initiatives that have been presented is part of that planning for the future. So the things that are included in there are sport and rec plan that needs to be reviewed. So that starts to position the council for what needs to be done with regard to its sporting facilities going forward, with the football ovals and everything else, and other sporting facilities that we actually provide. We've also got work in relation to the urban design framework, so from a economic development perspective, and what we can actually do to the main street and how we can actually grow our revenue through growing that commercial sector as well, rather than just increasing rate revenue and the residential sector bearing the brunt of that. By growing revenue, you also can the opportunity to grow your commercial sector. And so those sorts of things are in there. A few key things as well. So user charges, we have proposed a new fee, which is a spectator fee, and looked at the general admission charges for the swimming centre and the sports centre. So that's an extra $140,000 increase on top of last year's user charge income. Statutory fees, we're still waiting for the state budget or them starting to release information. I don't think that the federal government is in a position not to advance payments from that perspective. So I think that they're the main elements. As I said to council, while the goal is a challenge, and it will still be a challenge for us to be able to identify the $750,000 that we've already built into the budget. We know that to achieve or get close to having an operating surplus or a low operating deficit, we probably have to take about $1 to $1.5 million out of the recurrent budget, while we're also keeping rate revenue increases around the 5 to 6% plus growth, and then couple that with some restraint on operating new initiatives and capital spend as well, but not at the expense of not actually having to have that increase in maintenance costs, especially with regard to that capital and asset renewal.
Thanks, Sharon. Open it up for any questions, comments, statements. Mayor Redman.
Thank you for that update, Sharon. I think the deficit is still too high. I know that you've got $750,000 in the budget, but I think 1.963 is a little bit too high. We need to be looking at service reviews, and I know that I've had a chat with Andrew Goodsill about having those workshops. The two go hand in hand. You just don't do rate rises, but you do also do service reviews. So I'm really keen to look at the service review and see where we can save money.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to say? Sorry, it's not Andrew. Yep.
Normally, thank you through the chair. Normally I don't say much at these because I'm here just to observe. I know you do a good job, you don't need me saying much. But just in terms of what Karen raised, and she's right to raise it, we have talked about service reviews, but it's a little bit, it's a process to go through, I guess, to say. Ultimately, a proper service review is something that would take probably 4 to 6 months. We've done the workforce service review, which probably took a year or more, as Wendy would probably tell you. That was a bit more comprehensive than a service review you normally need to do, but I guess there were bigger issues to address in that respect. I think it's reasonable we commit next financial year to doing 1 or 2 of them. We might have to do it without any external support because it's on the budget to actually pay a consultant to do it, so it's more work for us. Lucky us. But I think there should be a culture of doing service reviews. I agree with that. But I can't just simply pull one literally out of thin air at the moment and say that that number, you can slice it by half, because that's not where we sit. That's what we need to start doing, and that's the culture we'll need to start developing.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Sharon.
Again, as I said, as an executive, we realise that effectively the challenge is ahead to actually, because it's not going to be an easy task to actually rip $1.5 million out of an established business where the opportunities to, I suppose, downsize or restructure are very, very limited from that perspective, because realistically to do anything more than service reviews and looking at how we're actually doing stuff, it is actually reducing and cutting services, which is a hard decision and a decision beyond the executive, other than making those recommendations of what those services can be, because that's realistically what we need to do. To do more, I think from an organisation perspective, so in addition to the $750,000 that we've identified that we need to strip out further, we did a comprehensive review of the existing budgets, and Erin and Renee and the team were quite hard in the sense of looking at budgets that had been submitted and looking back at past expenditure and areas where expenditure hadn't reached the budget that they were proposing, or they hadn't spent those budgets, where literally the response was, well, actually you're not going to get that budget this year because you haven't demonstrated that you actually need that money. So to sit there and say that we've got all of it, we probably haven't, and there's probably an opportunity again to actually go through that and identify areas even further. But I think from an organisational perspective, to strip more expenditure out of the budget is probably in the long run going to be a false economy, because we need to actually have a strategy rather than, and a strategy is more than just cutting expenditure out of the budget. I can reduce the numbers to whatever you want realistically on a page. I can do that, but I wouldn't have any confidence that I could actually substantiate and deliver on those numbers. I think the discussions that we've had at executive level, and which was then followed up with the discussion at the leadership group last week, I think having those discussions and having that target and that position has set the foundation for the organisation to have that full realisation of where we're at and what we actually need to do, and them working with us to actually achieve the outcome that we actually need to deliver on. Because again, it's not just this year. We'll be having the same discussions to them next year as well, in the sense of saying, okay, yep, that's great, you've found $1 million this year, now you have to give me another $1 million. So the audit committee can recommend it, the council can recommend it, but I don't have confidence that we would be able to deliver it. However, I feel that the approach and what we've actually done here, I have more confidence that we will actually be able to deliver this budget as it's presented, rather than not deliver it, because it is that bringing the organisation alongside as the leadership team as well to sit there and say, because as I said to the council, it's we, and as we said to the leadership team, it's we. It's how are we gonna work together to actually right the ship. You know, we do know that we need to be able to deliver what we want to do in the future with the big infrastructure projects, and actually to do the things that we know that we have to do to actually right the ship by looking at how we can actually grow our commercial revenue and all that sort of stuff. We have to actually incur this expenditure, because otherwise, if we're not incurring it, we're not doing anything, because we don't have the resources, as in the human resources, to actually be able to deliver that as well. So,
Thank you. Christine, would you like to go next?
I had some other questions, but I just want to pick up on the idea of commercial revenue. So if this budget includes expenditure to build that revenue, when do we expect that revenue to start coming in, and what sort of growth are we expecting in that revenue, either in this year's budget or future years?
Andrew.
Thank you, through the Chair. We provided a presentation to Council, might have been a week or two ago now, where we talked about taking that other side of the equation beyond cost cutting into income growth, and it's hard to give you a definitive date. I mean, basically what we can say is that in the town centre, we've modelled what the existing rates are. We know we're getting 2.4 million or thereabouts within the special rate area. We know that if the floor area, which is projected over the next 10 to 20 years, is delivered, that if you delivered that, 2/3, 3/4 of it in the town centre, like you should probably deliver with key sites, and if you had some reasonable extent of medium density housing on key sites, so mixed use development, which you see increasingly in town centres, you could basically increase the rate base by about 40% without any significant effort. Having said that, it won't take 5 minutes or 5 years. We're talking probably 10, 15, 20 years. But I think at the moment, part of the challenge is that you don't have a policy setting within the planning scheme to allow that to occur, even if you wanted it to. And that's probably the thing we can tackle probably sooner rather than later, because that doesn't require investment support to do that. We can do that through the review of the town centre design framework, and that's why there's a budget to do that work. But also perhaps work more closely with the landowners, because we did engage extensively with the community, but I don't think we did as much as we would probably like to do in hindsight with those who make the investment decisions that actually make that change achievable. So I just think the answer is I don't know exactly when you're going to get the increased rates, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think that's where we need to get to.
Thanks, Andrew. Have you got more questions, Christine?
Okay, back to the original question. So just looking at the balance sheet, it shows us what the borrowings are projected to be, 26.2 million at the end of this budget year, which is above the facility that we've got of 25.1 million, which is in the Treasury paper. So just wondering what's the appetite of the LGFA to increase the debt facility, and is 26.2 the peak debt during this budget period, or is that debt expected to go higher than 26.2 through the year?
I don't know whether, I suppose obviously the peak of the debt depends on the timing of the expenditure, to be honest. So realistically, so I can't answer that, whether it's actually going to peak halfway through. Obviously, it will all be dependent on the timing of when we're actually delivering the projects. Previously, in previous years, obviously, once the budget gets adopted, the first 3 months to the first 6 months is where a lot of that is the procurement activity happens. So you would sit there and say that would actually start peaking near the end of the year. with the rate revenue, because it's actually a quarterly, it comes in and goes up. So realistically, we will have some peaks and troughs during the year. But if all things being equal, the assumption is that based on that delivery of the achievement of the current budget and the delivery of the projects as across the year, by the end of the year, we will have that requirement for that funding. I think that the appetite would still be there for LGFA, because despite the fact that the debt limit has been reached, we're still under the 100% ratio of net financial liabilities as well. So obviously it's not that hard and fast $25 million that and you're not getting anything more. They still will look at the ratios of the net financial liabilities. So assuming that the rate revenue grows as based on the 6% and the 2% growth, I think that shouldn't be a problem. Again, the difference, their level of appetite will ultimately be dependent on understanding what we're actually doing to actually reduce those deficits and reducing and making sure that those deficits aren't continuing on. Because that's when they'll start putting those the covenants in and restricting us or showing more attention to us and making sure that we're actually delivering on what we actually said to in our asset management plans, in our long-term financial plans, from that perspective as well. So I don't necessarily think it will be a major issue.
Just looking at the future years, the debt goes up to 32 million the year after. So I guess at this stage, just pointing out the debt's increasing. It's above the current loan facility. Take your point about the ratios, but this comes back to risk appetite as well.
So in the long-term financial plan modelling, so obviously, so this modelling has been done without any of this major strategic projects. It's just on doing our renewal program, doing our asset management as per, or investment as per our existing asset management plans. There will be probably 2 or 3 years where we will still be in a borrowing position, but then we actually change, subject to timing of any major projects, that's when we'll actually be in a net repayment position, and that probably brings that probably in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll, without actually doing anything new, we'll be in a position where we could pay back all the debt, and we'll start generating that cash and having that cash in the bank as well. So it will peak. So I'm probably sitting there thinking by the end of this council term, first year in the next council term, that would actually be the peak, and then it will start have a capacity to repay. But then obviously at that point in time, there's probably going to be the introduction of some new projects, so it will flatten out. So at this point in time, the long-term financial plan says that we'll be debt-free by, in 6 years, 7 years. But we know that that's not going to be realistic, because we'll actually be introducing and borrowing for major investment in the town. So,
Peter, did you have some questions?
The first question, I just wanted to clarify what you were saying about the savings that are built into the budget. I heard the 750,000. Was that the total, including wages and materials? And 300,000 of that is in the materials area. Is that right? Something like that.
275 is in labour, and the balance of that is in materials. So it's about 475. Yep.
Just do your microphone, Peter. The microphone's going.
So that's built into the figures in the budget then, is that correct? That we've got in there?
Yes, that's been built in. So we've made that commitment to identify and deliver that during the year.
Yes, got another question. Well, the next point, I guess, is more of a point than a question. I really believe that the budget comparisons here should be based on the original budget from last year, rather than the revised budget during the year, because the original budget was the basis on which we taxed the people through the rating system. And there may be some things like that. I think part of the reason it's varied is because there were carry forward funds from a previous year, so that sort of kind of distorts the comparison. So I think as a matter of preference for future reference really is that the original budget be the basis on which you compare and explain the differences, so that the conversation explaining the rate increase is clear based on the nature of the movements between the years, and not just one-offs within a year. Having said that, it looks we're proposing a budget deficit of 1.495, and just to labour the point about my earlier comment, the comparison is that we've got a deficit of 1.926, but the actual deficit, original deficit, was $1.033 million. And that was what was used in the long-term financial plan and everything. And that was, so there's been a significant deterioration during the current year, but in terms of the long-term plan that we looked at and approved last year, we had a deficit of 1.03 million, and the forecast for the current financial year was a reduction to 853,000, and we're now talking about a deficit of 1.45 million, was it? Something like that. 495, nearly $1.5 million. So that's a significant deterioration. And I don't feel that that's sort of been explained in the documentation sufficiently. It certainly made it difficult for me to sort of get my head around what was happening here. But there's been clearly a deterioration that's occurred. I'm just not sure. I understand the need to put in some savings into the budget, but there's some risk in that, and both in timing, because every month that goes by, you lose another month of savings. It gets very tight unless you act very, very quickly. But I was pleased to see the attempt to predict a more or less a balanced budget by 2025-26 in the forecast there. However, I do have a little bit of uncertainty as to whether it's actually going to be achieved. So I'm a little bit sceptical, I guess. Another question I have, though, is in relation to employee costs. You talked about, I think, 5.5% or something, I think, earlier on. It seems to me that in the budget, despite there being a reduction based on vacancies and things that you talked about, 275,000 or whatever, the wage increase seems to have gone up by at least 8.5%, or depending on which you use as the base, it could be 9.8% if you use the revised figures that you've got there. So what explains the difference? I know, I guess part of it is the the superannuation increment, perhaps, but can you explain why those figures have gone up so much?
So in relation to the employee expenses, so as part of last year's adopted budget, so that was actually predicated on a 6.5% salary increase. What actually happened, because CPI was higher than we anticipated, that increase that was paid to staff, which came into effect on the 1st of July, was 7.9%, rather than actually us increase the budget as an executive team. What we actually did is to sit there and say, so we had a $250,000 target in there as part of that delivery of savings to reduce last year's operating deficit. What we actually said was, well, we're not actually going to increase for the difference between the 6.5 and 7.9. We'll actually increase our savings target through deferral of new appointments for any vacant positions. So obviously that level of, that was a one-off saving from this year, 23-24. Because we actually have a full complement of staff, we can't actually maintain those savings year on and year on. So that's where that jump is from, is because the wage rate was actually higher, and we can't actually, the only way we can actually embed those savings forever and a day is actually reduce our staffing complement. So when we've already got an existing staffing complement, so that's one of the reasons where the drive of that increase in expenses, and that's where we're sort of saying, okay, well, we can't necessarily keep on continually reduce our employee cost unless we actually get rid of staff, and realistically, until we go through that process of determining from a service level perspective, we you just arbitrarily sit there saying, okay, well, what staff how do you reduce your staffing numbers? So that's where we've actually moved to sit there and say, okay, well, realistically, how we can actually make savings is actually increase the efficiency of staff, so you actually reduce the level of materials and services that you actually contract out. So that's where realistically we know that just through that natural turnover there will be some savings because we can't replace staff straight away, but realistically some of that saving that we need to build into our cost base, we've actually transferred that from a labour perspective, from the employee expense line down to that materials and contracts line, because that's realistically how we can do it, because the only way we can actually, if we need to reduce our salary cost, natural attrition is realistically the only way we can actually do that at a no-cost perspective, because obviously under enterprise agreements there's no forced redundancies, so we can't, and then even if we want to make positions redundant and there's voluntary separations, there's a cost associated with that because we'll have to actually pay separation packages. So the position is to sit there and say, okay, for us to actually be able to extract the level of expenditure out of the business that we need to do, we need to actually make sure that our staff are doing are more efficient, doing the things that they need to do, and bring some of those services that we had previously contracted out in-house, and that's where you actually get those savings. In relation to, I suppose, the deterioration of the 23-24 budget to compared to what was adopted, some of those variations were that you're aware of from a depreciation expense. Depreciation expense was a lot higher at the end of the year, so that was one of those adjustments that we actually made, and that's actually been built into the base, and the long-term financial plan is actually being built off, all these forecast figures have actually been built off that the 24-25 budget, and forecast for. I think it would be probably, well, I know it will be not appropriate to actually use that adopted budget as a comparison and to build that base as well. So if the long-term financial plan and those numbers that are actually in the document was based off the 23-24 adopted budget, yes, we'll never achieve those outcomes. To go from that position, especially when we've had such a massive impact, a depreciation impact, and we've had a massive impact from an interest perspective as well, because through the interest rate and not taking the opportunity of fixing the interest rates back a couple of years ago as well. So those sorts of things that weren't actually in the long-term financial plan that you're comparing to as to what the differences are. So those things, and we do know that there was errors in the adopted budget where, the maintenance charge associated, the fixed maintenance charge associated with the street lighting, which was omitted. So while I understand your position on whether we compare it to the adopted budget versus the revised budget, I think going back to the adopted budget probably would just add that layer of complexity, which has already been communicated to, I suppose, the council and the committee, to sit there and say, okay, well, these are where the major changes are happening. So again, yes, it's going to be a big task to actually return to surplus, but again, if the scenario of that, the rate revenue, we still have a period of high rate revenue and have that cost control and try and extract that $1.5 million. If we don't extract that $1.5 million out of the business, yep, we aren't going to achieve that. But and that's realistically what it's dependent on, is extracting that $1.5 million out of the recurrent budget, because that's where we need to do. So currently the recurrent budget is forecasting a operating loss or an operating deficit of $897,000. That's where our focus needs to be, and how do we actually do that? And the only way we can do that is extract expenses and do rate revenue increases that are reflective of the level of service and where we actually need to be.
Thanks, Sharon. Sorry. Okay, go, Peter. Yep.
But just in terms of the...
No. No.
That's on?
Yep,
okay,
you're on.
Good. Yeah, beg your pardon. Yeah, just in relation to that, your commentary on the adopted budget, previous adopted budget, and moving forward, I think it actually helps the situation, because you made the comment about the depreciation has gone up. That becomes a reason for having to increase your rates. It's not about what staff know and what elected members know, it's what the community is going to be told and explain why they've got to have a rate increase or whatever. It's so the explanation, the clarity of explanation between one year and the next year, the increase in depreciation that occurred is all wrapped up with increase in construction costs and so on, which everybody knows is just going through the roof. And they become the costs that the council has to bear, and it becomes a reason for the pressure on ratepayers also to pay to maintain the services and infrastructure and so on. So yeah, I don't resolve from the fact that I think the original budget is the actual basis on which you should make the comparisons. Yeah, I mean, I think the other question I have is in terms of the wages is the difficult question. You probably can't answer it, but what is being provided for in terms of the increase in wages through the EB process this year? Because what was it, 7 point something or other last year based on inflation. Yeah, nearly 8%. And that, basing it on a CPI, which is... No, well, that was part of my question. The wage price index is another sort of benchmark that people use, and that's, currently it's down around 4% or something. But I guess you'd be wanting to try and, maybe, wrong word, but claw back some of the increase that you made last year into the, not be so generous going forward. Comment. A comment.
Through the chair. Obviously we're in the throes of negotiations at the moment, so I probably don't necessarily want to go into too much detail in relation to, and we haven't had any discussions on the price of that component yet, but needless to say that I suppose the trend of the last lot of negotiations of having a figure or CPI, whichever is the highest, that position's well and truly off the table. So it will be a fixed number. From our perspective, the offer will be cognizant of the budget constraints that we have, and realistically the conditions that are being, I suppose, offered or asked for on the other side of the table as well. So, so we're still having those discussions at the moment about what the change of conditions, and then obviously once those what's agreed and costed, that will determine what the increase. But again, yes, we've put a number in here for need. I think it's probably an appropriate level. It's probably going to be around the mark, realistically, based on current discussions that we've had with the negotiating committees. So I don't think that we're going to be caught out as like we did last year.
Andrew, yep.
Further to what I said before, I'm conscious that I probably gave you a bit of a skeleton of the answer, but I didn't put the flesh on the creature. A few things I'll mention which probably would be relevant. So there's the growth in the CBD, which we've talked about as being a slow burn, but even in the short term with the Audi supermarket redevelopment, which has got approval, and if you look at the signs, there's short-term leases now and people are starting to move out of that area. We're seeing construction probably in 24, 25, and that's probably between $5 and $10 million. I have to check the exact number. We also have in the commercial area another application which hasn't been formally lodged, but we're talking greater than 10 million, could be up to $20 million. That's just the commercial aspect of it. But I guess the bit I didn't talk about was the residential component. So if you look at Evanston Gardens, Evanston South Cuddler, if you look behind the OTR development at the moment, you've got 150 or so lots being created for Vigara subdivision. You've got the Hillier Park Residential Village expansion, which I memory was 800 retirement village units, but it could be a different number, but don't hold me to that number. But it's a substantial, we're talking hundreds of such units. We've got a substantial residential amendment on Coventry Road, which is called the Gonus Code Amendment. Our issue isn't so much we haven't got interest, the issue is about coordinating it so that we can do it in a way that makes some sense. But I think there is clearly capacity there which will give us a pipeline of opportunities, and I suspect it might be in the last recent few years our growth rate's been closer to 1.5 than 2%, but it's easy to see it going well above 2%. But what we're doing at the moment is that structure planning, strategic planning that actually makes that achievable, and I think that's where we probably haven't quite been in the game as far as we would like to be. Another thing also which I've mentioned is employment land. So we have a shortage of employment land in the town. We're supposed to have 15 to 20 years supply and we don't. The existing industrial employment zone areas are largely developed, and of course, as you know, we had the debate about the Doors Code Amendment, which went the way that it did. But ultimately, there is significant amounts of land in the south which we're working on, which will come into the planning equation over the next 12 to 18 months as being formalised, I hope, as preferred areas for employment investment. And I think that will bring significant new opportunities as well. So that legacy, I hope, will start to be enjoyed during the life of this council, but certainly in the next council. And I guess finally, I guess my comment would be that the legacy of the council perhaps isn't to be judged in the next 12 months, because I suspect Sharon's dead right, that we can give you all sorts of numbers, but we have to be credible. I think it's more the legacy is that we actually get to have some confidence we can get to an operational surplus during the life of the council, and the work we're doing now we'd have to duplicate next council, and we can start doing detailed design and construction to actually get those rates and get the income and opportunity we probably need.
Thanks, Andrew. Councillor Shanks.
Yeah, thank you. Look, Peter, I take your point in regards to previous budget. I think I've talked to Sharon offline and online before, and finding it a little bit hard as an elected member to track changes when we're talking about $40 million. It's natural to lose track of 470 here and $500,000 here and the like. But you're absolutely right. This is what we go out to our ratepayers and we pull money out of their pockets. So what we're going to deliver on, I think we do need to be pretty accurate on it. What I am sort of seeing in this budget cycle, which credit to Sharon and the executive team, is a little bit more, look, in lack of a better term here, and I'm probably losing the words a little bit, but honesty, and I don't mean that with malice intent on the predecessors, but what I'm talking about is a different way of maybe communicating. It's become very, very clear in more recent times that some of our strategic documents were albeit as beautiful as they all are, we pay the consultants $50,000 to come forward with great ideas, but unless we implement those ideas, there's really no point in investing the $50,000 in the first place, because those actions need to have linkages to our long-term financial plans, and they have been sort of lacking for a long, long time, and that is for one reason or another. We can't go back in time. We are where we are. And when we talk about service reviews and quality improvement, we can have the best plans, but unless you have the appetite to enact on those plans and quality improvement and the like in any business, it always comes back to the systems that you have in place and your employees wanting to follow those systems and thriving to improve on those systems. Now, that's not to say that our current 140 contingent of staff aren't already doing that, but when we do have the executive team saying, oh, some of our systems are a little bit broken, or we might have a little bit of a culture shift that we need to look at, what are we doing in relation to the conversation that Sharon and the team, rightfully so, are saying, hey, that budget line item that you had $100,000 for? Well, we've just gone back and realistically you've spent $40,000 on that same line item for the last, so we're going to drop that. Now, is that going to cause a strive to want to be efficient with the 40,000, or try to prove to overspend to the 100,000? Now, again, these are all speculative things, but these are all risks that we need to maintain, manage, quality review and the like. I used the analogy last time at our last budget meeting that I feel like we're running around with a fire extinguisher putting out spot fires without the ability to understand who the hell's lighting them, right? So there is going to be a fair bit of, I think, trust we're going to put into the new team here, potentially, on how we're going to do this. The things I'm liking and the things I'm not liking, I'll go back to them, and accept that if we talk about systemic problems and service reviews and the like, we can cut something as simple as, I'll use the Christmas carols as an example. That was a $35,000 spend that an elected member chose. Do we look at another model potentially? Roughly so, we should constantly look at these things. But the reality there is any in-kind support that we might allocate to that will come from our staffing pool will just be reallocated elsewhere. It doesn't end up in a saving because we can't just fire that staff because they've done nothing wrong, obviously, So where we've got to is we've built this machine based on a long-term financial plan that is missing some linkages to strategic outcomes that we've said we want, but we haven't actually got to the nitty-gritty of how we're going to achieve them. So now we're in this, well, I think the buzzword word in local government at the moment is budget repair. You know, we're seeing that flow through. But look, you know, if that's where we're at, then that's what we need to be able to communicate. And I take your point in relation to the budget cycle last year. Where were our overs and unders? And what are we doing to improve on them next year? And how does that look in comparison? And then everything that happens on the monthly reviews, the quarterly reviews, and the things that we report up to the elected body, you know, the elected members are going to have to take a bit of initiative there as well in trying to improve them and unpack the numbers. It does become pretty hard when there's so many of them, but you know, we do rely on our audit and risk as well, although we might have had a difference in opinion last budget cycle, but that aside. And again, those qualitative outcomes is always going to come back to the wants to have that quality improvement. And we are seeing a bit of that, which I credit to the executive team. I have constantly talked about the mix of rates. I like the appetite in looking for the commercial and residential mix. I think we're completely out of balance here. That's why we have to rely on our residential rate income, because obviously that's 80% of our income. The strategic document, this is where we're going to have to be a little bit careful on our messaging, because the skeptic in me says, well, you're back to where you were 10 years ago when you started the journey of doing your strategic documents and the review process. And who's to say in 10 years' time we're not going to see the town centre framework that's going to go from 2024 to 2046, and then 2046, the growth framework, we get to 2046 and I'm a little bit greyer and talking about the same problems, you know. It's how do we navigate through that where we have tangible, measurable outcomes, and how do they link to our long-term financial plan? The employee costs, I think I picked up the last budget cycle, our long-term financial plan catered for $750,000. That wasn't updated, and it was 2.5 million over a certain budget cycles, like over certain years, but it just wasn't updated. You know, our employee costs seem to go up really cleverly to what we forecast it was going to be, but our revenue didn't. So there's a difference, I'm feeling a difference, but until we see these cycles run through, we'll never know how efficient they were.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Redmond.
I'd like to see risk appetite in our documents, in our council reports. We do have a risk management framework, however, that doesn't touch on the risk appetite. We've done that work, and I'd like to see our risk appetite in all our reports, because I think that takes us back to what we agreed as a council. So we've done that work, and I still cannot see a risk appetite. And that takes us back to the core responsibilities of the workshop that we did, and the outcome of that risk appetite. It is really good to have that risk appetite, and it actually takes us back to what we agreed to as part of those themes. So I think that might be something to consider.
Yeah, because I'm just looking, we've got in the papers you have the risk evaluation, but not not to the risk appetite. So that might be something to consider going forward. Yeah. I think I was just having a look. I really like the presentations that you put together, and basically with the principles. I mean, that's the way, you know, to work out to achieve your budget. Like, you can put numbers, you can create any numbers that you want, but you do have to have those principles in place, and you do have to have, you know, the executive and their teams understanding of how you're going to achieve the budget and the cost cutting, and I like the whole fact that, you know, you're saying we just can't add a new project. Like, if you remove something, you know, to take, you know, if you're looking at a new project, you need to lose an existing project, and that kind of trying to get that balance. in the budget. It's a sort of a statement and a question. I was just tying it all together with the, and I know we've discussed this at a previous audit committee meeting, and because now we've got the oversight from ASCOSA, and I know it was your last slide on the budget presentation. Because what my understanding, if I put it in layman's terms, I know I'm paraphrasing and stuff like that, but basically we had a long-term financial plan, we had a strategic plan. It was basically, this is the vision for the town of Gawler. Now, as an audit committee, all the modelling was done as to what the rate increase had to be, because one of the only levers that we've got to increase revenue is the rate, to increase the rates in at least accordance with CPI. We suggested the number. Of course, council didn't agree with that, and so slashed the revenue that Gawler is going to, to earn this year. So what, do you want to just clarify to me, Sharon, what's the consequences then? Because it's saying that, ASCOSA is focusing on the linkage between the long-term financial plan, the asset management plan, the business plans, the budget, the funding plans. We don't have the revenue that we needed to achieve those plans. So how is that going to be reported, or what's the actual consequences of that? Because, I understand the really good points being made, but the council decided not to earn the revenue that we needed to achieve our strategic objectives. So therefore, everything has to be revised and reduced in accordance with the amount of revenue that we're actually going to earn. And this is the consequences, working out, well, what levers have we got, because we're not going to maximise revenue, so therefore we're going to have to reduce expenditure. And this is the result of it, reducing expenditure, and with all the, the focus areas of trying to, do we really need things, or, how can we cut back on every expenditure line item, which, I do that in my day job as well. It's an exhausting process, and you really have to look at that productivity. You have to bring in the management of projects that has to become in-house. You can't outsource anything anymore. The cheapest way to do it is to bring it in-house and to increase the productivity of employees who are pretty much at 100% productivity. It's how much harder can you work with the energy you've got. So sorry, that's a long-winded question, but Sharon, I suppose my question is, with that missing link, what was going to be the consequence of this ASCOSA reporting?
I think that effectively the ASCOSA report is probably going to say that we're probably underfunded for the delivery of services that we want to actually deliver on, and that we're not probably financially sustainable, and that there's probably the linkages that are required are probably not there in our forward forecast. Based on, so with the ASCOSA, they also look at the past as well, so they will be looking at the past. So in relation to the ASCOSA review, I probably was thinking about it and trying to work out what can we do in this budget cycle to minimise the negative impact of that ASCOSA review. Because I'll be honest, I will sit there and say that it's not going to be pretty. I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think they will say that we're unsustainable, that we either have to increase our revenue or reduce services to actually be able to come back to be a sustainable council. So one of the things that with recent discussions with Bentley's, so I've actually asked them to do a review because obviously they've been part of councils that have actually gone through the ASCOSA review. So I've asked them to actually look at our past documents, our current documents, just to sort of identify, I suppose there's gaps that we've actually got that we can potentially make sure that we can actually build into our current suite of documents and understanding that, rather than sort of going along as we are, getting the SCOSA review and then realising that we've got a whole heap of gaps in our existing documents that we need to actually rectify over the next 3 years. I think it's a 3-year cycle before the SCOSA comes back in and does their next review as well. So the plan is to have that report to the May Audit Committee. So we might have a better idea at that point in time what the consequences are of some of those past decisions, and what we actually need to do. Again, I think the documents that they're going to review are probably going to be lacking, but hopefully we have the opportunity to present some of the stuff that we're actually doing through this budget cycle, to sit there and say, okay, well, we've recognised that that's a problem, and this is how we're actually addressing it, and this is how we're going to be building it into our forward targets. So, and I think obviously a SCOSA, it's a rate oversight, it's advice. So obviously the council can choose to take the advice or not take the advice. You know, it's not necessarily one of those things that we have to actually implement all their recommendations that they present, because it is just an advisory scheme. Again, it may also be, I suppose, beneficial to us when we're going out to the community to talk about potential service level changes and all that sort of stuff, about that fact of, you know, we've had this oversight, we've had this independent review, something needs to change. It's either the service or the rate. So again, it's how that gets communicated and how we can use that document to, I suppose, position ourselves, because again, it's not, it is that thing, it's a combination of expenses and revenue. We need that. It can't be one-sided, and it is that balance of which lever is the easiest to pull, and none of them are. And it's just getting that balance right. But realistically, we know it's increasing rates continually is not the solution either. From that perspective, we just need to get that. I think it is that fundamentally thing of how do we reduce that expenditure. And yes, depreciation is a big number. You know, as a percentage, it's 26, 27% of our total expenditure, which I would consider quite high for a council this size as a percentage of total expenditure. I'd probably expect it to be around between the 20 to 22% as a general rule of thumb as you expend. So, you know, that is a big number that we are actually having to deal with. You know, so realistically, that's probably one area that we really do need to focus on for the next 12 months, and understanding that asset management and understanding that asset valuation and of those long-term assets as well, and really getting a handle on understanding the impact of those new assets that are being gifted to us each year as these new developments come online. And realistically understanding that impact and what that has from a depreciation impact, but also has it from a maintenance impact, but also from an asset management perspective as well. So because it doesn't, you know, logically, it doesn't seem rational to sort of sit there and say 12 months later, after you've taken an asset that's got a life of 100 years, that would increase the value of the replacement cost of that asset by 10%. Because prices have moved by 10% in 12 months, you know, when we know, you know, it might have moved 10%, you know, in the end over that 100 years. I'm not going to be here to find out to test that theory, but you know, it is that rationale and that approach, rather than I suppose just applying that pure mechanics of those sorts of decisions and that position, because that number is quite high. And yes, we have to fund it, but again, do we have the capacity to deliver that level of renewals as well? Because that's the other thing as well. So But yeah, does that answer your question?
And it does. Well done. Because I mean that's what we're seeing at a state government level as well. As as our revenue gets slashed, is that all the things that we used to do to provide a public service and be nice, and just all the sort of the freebies that used to be given. They're all we have to stop. We have to stop doing it. We have to stop being doing things that we're not paid for, and then it comes down to a fee for service. If people, at a local government, if they don't want to increase their rates, well then, as you said, it's your level of service is going to be reduced. You're not going to have the level of service that you used to have because the numbers just don't work anymore. And it's disappointing, but that's the outcome of not having the rate increases. Councillor Shanks.
Look, I don't disagree with any of that. I guess as an elected body, as a council, what we need to be able to do is we need to go out to our ratepayers and be able to sell what we're asking money for. And unfortunately, if we do see a consistent line of what I've called bottlenecking for however many years now on the service delivery that we talk about, and to be nice and to be that front of house and public service business that we are as a council, then we do actually need to deliver on those things, and we do need to have projects that run the way that projects are supposed to run. When they don't, we need to learn from our mistakes and improve the next cycle. And again, we come back to that appetite thing, because if we don't have that appetite and we do have the backlog but no strategies in around dealing with the backlog, then absolutely. And then it goes to the way we communicate as well with our community. You touched on the rate increase, and again, I take on board your feedback and completely understand where you're coming from. When the Chamber moved to put $379,500 below the line, being the boundary reform project, the budget repair that we were in at that point in time was still a mix between the way we're getting communicated with now and the way we were of the past as well. There was a difference of where we'd park grant money that might have showed a different level of what level of debt you're actually at, and we talk about how you're budgeting each year and you show your actuals. We had financial ratios that are quite easy to move around depending on how you expend your invoices come June or 1st of July, right? Projects that we're told they're coming to an end, they're coming to an end last quarter. Oh, by the way, they're not coming to an end. These sorts of things and this sorts of messaging makes it really, really hard for us to go out to our community and sell the rate increases when we're seeing the backlog. We're seeing shelters that cost 5 or 6 times the amount they should because of a choice of management back when. And again, we're seeing that quality improvement come through. And I do take on board the point that $379,500 is a good example to raise. That was for a boundary reform investigation that we, as the elected body, chose to pass that savings onto the ratepayer, and whether or not we should have left it in and pay off debt is a conversation that I've been trying to have offline with you for the last few months, but I chose to join the audit committee instead. So. But that particular project, as a perfect example, is actually coming at $180,000 now. But we went out to our community at the time and said it's going to be 370. I think it was 175. Was it? Yeah, 175 was that investigation. But regardless, the point still remains that we went out to our ratepayers and we said we need $379,500, and we will give you this. But the reality is, if we didn't touch it, what we would have expended was 175 or 189, whatever it was. And then we'd be talking about the communication that I think you and I both agree on where did the 200,000 go? And that's where it becomes hard to track. And then that's where it becomes hard to get that trust, that money that we need to pull out of our ratepayers' pockets to give them what's best. But we need to be able to prove that we can spend the money. And we need to be able to prove we can spend the money efficiently. And that's on the back end of a whole tail of things that's a lot older than one budget cycle, because our overs and unders, we know, move quite drastically. I think you called it deterioration. I think it's just this business to a degree and what we're doing to manage it. But absolutely take on board your point, and I think the elected bodies coming in, if nothing else, with radar up, and look forward to doing the budget cycle throughout. Whether or not we arrive at the same position you guys do is going to be whatever it's going to be. But if we got to the point where we just needed to agree with everyone, then why even rock up,
Yep. Noted. All right, any other questions, comments, Peter?
Only, I think there's been a good discussion, and I think, I sense the council's in some sort of turning point at the moment, and it's good to hear what you have to say, Nathan. But having trust, having good information, having trust, having a kind of unified body certainly helps put the organisation in the right direction. It's someone said to me once that if an organisation that's failing is an organisation is like an orchestra that's playing out of tune, and if you can get to be playing into tune, then the music can be really good. So it is important to have that degree of common purpose and moving in the same direction. There's just one other thing I wanted to question, and that is in relation to rates, and Councillor Shanks sort of, I think, alluded to it as well, in terms of, we just set a percentage, but are we looking at commercial, industrial, do you have any rural, primary? Yeah, a bit of that. It's worth looking at all of those things. We don't have to set the same rate increase to each level. They're differentiated and so on. So it's worth looking at whether there's any room for, just tweaking things here and there to maximise what you can get to balance the budget. And I think a lot of councils are putting the rates up a lot more than might think at the moment. Yeah. I know my council's looking at 8%. No, they're going into budget disrepair. So anyway, I can't. Anyway, I was asked to do a review at a rural council recently where they wanted to reduce the primary production rate, which had already had a discount to it, until I started looking at the individual people within the properties within the primary production, most of which are corporates, and they live in Sydney or, they're, and they're getting a discount already. I mean, it's just criminal. And the value of their properties is going up astronomically. So you just got to have a very much an investigative approach to looking at your rate base and picking the eyes out of it a bit. So I know you've got the rate set. It looks pretty high, but then you've got a rebate that comes into, because the target has been the major supermarkets and whatever to make them pay the appropriate rate. But the ratio of that differential may be something that should be looked at as well. I don't know, but I would just encourage that to be part of the equation in your thinking. And even, you say 6%, 6.25%, it's small in terms of the difference in rates for most people. It's not much, but it will help a lot in bridging the gap bit by bit. 1,000 cuts will get you there eventually. But beside all that, I mean, Gawler's got is in a fantastic position long term. I mean, the sort of development that we've been talking about is going to come. It's going to be a little bit away from our immediate horizon, I think. So.
Thanks, Peter. First of all, Sharon, did you want to just...
Yeah, I think that's it's always that thing about the rate revenue versus the rate increase. Like, so obviously the rate revenue increase from last year actually only related to $53 for the residential ratepayer, which, in a period of high inflation and lots of cost increases and all that sort of stuff, it was a fair, more than, I suppose, fair and positive outcome for the ratepayer compared to the impact of. Whereas if we actually retained, and I know you don't agree, Nathan, but effectively it would have only been potentially, an extra $10 for the ratepayer from an average residential ratepayer, and so in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not, it's not a lot of money from that context, but the implications for the organisation and the community as a whole in what we can deliver, it does have that consequence as well. So from that perspective, but yeah, we do provide that discount from the commercial sector, and we do review that each year as to what level of discount and what the appropriate is for, and looking at that type of I suppose businesses that are in each of those categories as well, and to determine whether that threshold needs to increase or needs to decrease as to what that level of investment is from or discount that's actually provided.
Vacant land, we have 20% on our vacant land. Other councils have 120%. 120%.
So our differential is 160. So effectively, they pay 60% more than the general rate. So it's 160% on top of that is what we actually do vacant land. So it's greater than 20% now. It's 60%. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Christine.
Just a comment on decimal point percentage increases in rates. On page 12, there's a little graph bottom left that shows the budget and the long-term financial plan rate revenue. And I'm not looking at the colour one. Hang on. And so what that shows is that the draft budget is less than the long-term financial plan. It's only a couple of $100,000, but if you're wanting to stay close to long-term financial plan numbers to decrease commentary in ASCOSA reports, that might be an opportunity just to bring it up a bit closer to long-term financial plan. And the numbers are too hard in my head, but maybe that would be a 6.25% rather than 6% rise.
Councillor Shanks.
Thank you. So in regards to going up the 0.25, which, to be honest, I'm not against having the sorts of conversations that we need to be having, absolutely. I do caution trying to make sure that your budget looks better for the ASCOSA review, though. To me, yeah, no, absolutely. With all due respect, obviously, but ASCOSA coming in and being able to have a look and have a higher level approach is like any business pulling in an accountant, and you don't want to be fed candy. You want to be able to get down to the nitty gritty on what needs to happen. I think it's a pretty well documented fact that our council is predominantly residential rate based. That is a problem that we do have to manage each budget cycle, and our ratepayers wear the brunt of it, and that's why it is very, very important that we deliver on what we say we're going to and the like, because they are the residential ratepayer. And absolutely, Sharon, I don't disagree with, you know, the amount spread across all the ratepayers last year was a nominal amount to most people. I don't disagree with that, but we still get back to that trust point and where we need to go out. When we talk about our commercial mixes and the like, we need to get past that, just getting the money in to plug the leaks, because right now we're in that plugging the leak, and it doesn't really matter what we go out and say we're going to do. We use it for operational expenditure, and then, you know, things get a little bit delayed, and then we use it for operational expenditure, and we keep going. And it just seems like until we do have that appetite, which again we're starting to see flow through, and time will tell if it has that you know, quantity of outcome that we need. But partnered with the ASCOSA report, I think is a good thing. You can't fix what you don't know. That's this mentality that seems to get overlooked in some cases on, oh, we just need to make the books look good. No. We need to make the business operate well. And when we start making the business operate well, everything else we talk about starts happening organically, and we're in that, hey, let's make the business work well mode at this point in time. Would have it been great if we were there a decade ago or 5 years ago? It doesn't really matter at this point. We just need to actually think about how we manage that. And that's when we come into, and I think Mayor Edmund's absolutely right, you know, talking about that risk appetite. I joined the Audit and Risk Committee this time round because it's called Audit and Risk now. Not to say what you guys were doing wasn't fantastic before, but that risk side, when we talk about risk appetite, that's not just a motherhood statement. You know, if we have a reputational risk level, we need to figure out what decisions we make will have on that reputational risk. If we have a financial risk appetite, we need to actually be real on what that will look like, not what we can make it look like, what it actually looks like. And the language we're talking about, taking on new assets and then calculating in what that looks like on that new asset being in our portfolio for this year, next year, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, all links back to the long-term financial plan and the like, you know. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting, you know, interesting time, because this is going to be a budget repair that is going to be spread, I think, over multiple budget cycles coming through. But unless we're asking the right questions and we have the right appetite, we're going to keep on getting the same, realistically. So yeah. In regards to commercial development, one last comment to make there. What also we've seen happen, and the Bunnings development that was brought up by the acting CEO, rightfully so. What we've seen happen in the past is development comes and happens to us instead of, hey, we're open for business and this is where we want development, which makes it really, really hard to be able to, one, plan for it, try to back engineer how that fits in with our vision or some long-term infrastructure that we can maybe get the developer to do some of it, but then comes into our portfolio, and then we have to depreciate and deal with the maintenance, and we have to, and if that's thrusted on you by a proponent-led code amendment, you know, in a 6-month period, that can completely flip your switch on a decimal point or the like that we have to allow for from now on out. If we have a bit better of a vision on where we want this development, this commercial development, if we agree that our mix is not quite where it needs to be, if our ASCOSA report comes back and says, hey guys, you can't just keep on charging your residential ratepayers, you're unsustainable, but we don't have a solution on how to get out of that, well then we're leaving ourselves in a position where the boundary reform conversation talks to an amalgamation conversation, because why would we have a little residential council? Now that's not a conversation I want to be able to have. I want to be able to have a strategy to make sure that we are sustainable, that we are Gawler, that our identity is what it is. So yeah, I think again we go back to those strategic plans and then also what we're willing to allow in development, because those commercial rates I think are going to be the real solutions of the problem, not just the band-aids that we keep on trying to plug the leaks at the moment.
Makes sense. All right, are there any other comments, questions, statements? No? Yep, everyone good? All right, so we have a officer's recommendation that the draft FY25 budget set out in the financial statements contained in attachment 1 be endorsed in principle for the purpose of community engagement of the draft FY25 annual business plan and budget. Do I have a mover?
Bit more discussion. I'm just wondering if we should note some factual things here rather than just endorsing everything. Along the lines of linking back to risk appetite. I'm just doing a brain dump at the moment rather than proper wordings, but in bullet point form, I'm thinking around linking back to risk appetite, and I can't remember what the financial risk appetite is here, but I'm sure it's something, yeah, conservative.
So I've got the...
Oh, okay.
Yes, I remember seeing it somewhere.
So maybe if we just put bullet point for now, ideas, so a link back to risk appetite, a comment about exceeding the current debt facility limit. We've talked a lot about strategy and how maybe commercial development should be part of a future strategy and how that's going to help with financial stuff. Yeah, so I'm thinking some link to thinking along the lines of solutions, because if we're talking about this is a budget repair year, but in the future years things will be better and debt will be paid off and all of that, I think we need to make some comment about that, that if we are going to endorse a loss-making budget. Yeah. So I'm trying to say something about, basically we don't want to see a budget like this every year, so we want to make some reference to a solution for a turnaround type concept.
The word that was used, the differentiating rates.
And maybe that's... Yeah. Yeah.
So rate differentiation, that's a word. Rate differentiation, someone captured that. There we go.
So that's a start to a bit of a brain dump just on some commentary on the budget rather than just saying, yep, tick.
Yep, good point.
Can I just add a comment through the chair? So why I don't have any issue in relation to exceeding the current debt facility, I think it also needs to be predicated that it's still within the net financial liabilities ratio, because I think the concern that if you just talk about the fact that we're exceeding the debt, you know, I would sit there and say, realistically, this budget is year one of a financial strategy, and that financial strategy shouldn't just be focusing on the debt facility, because the debt facility was set at a point in time based on a rate revenue and a operating position, probably, you know, 5 or 10 years ago, you know, which hasn't necessarily been updated as a result of the fact that the council has grown. So that was probably my only concern, if we actually just note that it's exceeding the debt facility or the debt limit, because it's still within, you know, it's only 85% of the rate as a net financial liability ratio.
It's time to review the facility limit?
Well, I think that there will come a point in time, but again, I suppose it's to sit there and say, okay, well, we need to make sure that effectively, as I said, you know, this is year one of a financial strategy, and the financial strategy is probably something that needs to lead into the review of the long-term financial plan, which will pretty much happen, you know, straight away, if not before this budget is adopted, to sit there and say, okay, well, you know, this is where we're sort of settled on our draft budget as our base year. This forms the foundation, and our financial strategy is to actually be able to repair or return the budget to a surplus position, and we'll set a target, whether it's next year or whether it's by the end of the council term, as to what's realistically, what can realistically be done. And yes, the debt is one of that things, because realistically, we still have to spend money, because if we sort of get too hung up on this debt facility and exceeding this debt facility, the first thing the council's going to do is rip back the capital expenditure, which is essential, because if we don't do that capital expenditure, we're just going to continually be budgeting for operating deficits, because we've got this maintenance stuff that we actually have to continually maintain our roads to actually keep them in a okay state until we actually get the funds to actually be able to I suppose, spend and do that. And what's actually happening is, where we could potentially be getting away with reseals, what we're actually going to be doing then, when we're actually doing them, we're actually going to be doing reconstructions, which is actually more expensive. So you sort of get into this false economy that having some of those sorts of comments probably creates that false economy, which I don't necessarily is where, as a strategy, is where I think the Audit Committee actually wants the council to set its mind to.
Noting that it's exceeding, but we could add to that to say, but still within financial liability ratios. Happy with that, but I just think we need to note, however we word it, that it's the budget's exceeding the current debt facility limit. We can say it's within the financial ratios, and maybe we say something like the debt facility could be reviewed to recognise the growth in the council. If it hasn't been reviewed for 5 years, then it probably is overdue.
So you want that all under point C? Yep, cool. Current debt facility B.
Between acknowledging that the budget shows that debt will rise above the debt facility, but then also basically saying that that is fixable, like it's not a disaster. But I just don't, I just don't think we should endorse a budget without making some comment around the debt levels.
Yeah. So I think, so the draft. Yeah.
No worries. Look, I get what you're trying to do, and I don't disagree with it. There is a time for motions without notice as well. You could, if you saw fit, move a motion without notice that you recommend to the Audit and Risk Committee, recommend to Council that they note some of these dot points as you see fit, in your professional opinion, as a standalone potentially as well. And again, well, either or, but just to, tease out those conversations and really sort of highlight those points if you needed to as well. But again, just a suggestion there.
Yeah, thank you.
I do like the risk appetite, please.
Yep. Sorry, I've just pushed the button again, Kristen. My fault.
I think it's all part of the same topic.
Just watching the great content that's being created. Just watching the great content being created. Go.
So just on the risk appetite, obviously that was a workshop that we all enjoyed being able to talk through. I guess, how do you guys see it implemented, or what experience do you have in other areas, in local government and the like, on how those things are talked about? Risk appetite for me is a slightly different thing, but very comparable to what we do in construction, and it's not a new system, and there's even the ISO standards that we fall back on when we talk about all these different risks that we manage. I mean, for selfish reasons, I'd love to be able to get to a point where some of those systems actually make sense and translate over to local government, but I know that's going to take a minute. But I guess just from your point of view, like, I'd love to be able to have those conversations as the Mayor would, because it's audit and risk, but how do we start being able to bring some of those business decisions and test them through our risk appetite? How do you see that working in this committee?
Do you want to pop your microphone on?
I think to start with, we have a risk appetite in our reports, in all reports, in council reports, so that we can look back and see what is our risk appetite, and refer to that, and that will assist us to understand all the risk appetites that we had under those themes. Like there's reputational risk, there's financial risk, there's operational risk, there's corporate risk, etc., etc. So there's lots of different themes within that document, and I think that we need to get back to basics and look at those risk appetites that we agreed on, and we were assisted by Bentley's, which was really a fantastic process, and I look forward to Bentley's looking at the gaps, as Sharon said. So I think that risk appetite is, we're not understanding the risk appetite, and because we don't see it, and so I think the risk here is that we are unsustainable. However, we have the first year of a strategic plan to get back on track. So I think that we are doing the work. So I think that we will get over that hurdle. We will get over that hurdle. Yeah.
Because the risk appetite was in Sharon's presentation, like one of the PowerPoint presentations, and so we're saying financial, that council has a conservative risk appetite for variations to approved operating and capital project budgets, and is prepared to accept medium levels of risk. So we're applying that to budgeting. So it's sort of, when you get to sort of your financial risk appetite, there's only so much that you can flex. But then you would go, like you were saying before, when you think of your reputational risk and all the other risks that are involved of, okay, so you're pretty strict with the financial, your risk appetite financially is conservative, but how does that flow on effect with your reputational risk? Sorry.
I think that we need to keep it simple. We need to use simple language for people in our community. I personally like simple language. I don't like acronyms, as Andrew well knows. And I think that understanding the issue, understanding that we need to maybe review services, but we also need to raise rates. But what are those rates going to pay for? So, etc., etc., etc. And we need to understand that this is what the rates are going to pay for, this is what the rates are going to do, this is our capital budget. We are still doing, looking at our asset management plans, we're looking at our long-term financial plans, we're looking at our assets with renewal, but not necessarily new initiatives. And I think that we need to look at how we spend our money, because I think that, you know, 1.9, it's actually 1.9, and yeah, I'd really like to get that down. So I think that that's a good outcome.
Yeah, and I think also it goes back to your point that you touched on, like the risk of not delivering what we promise we're going to deliver. Yeah. And the council, you're saying that the council has a zero appetite for not delivering on promises. No. So you can have a conservative, you know, we're conservative with financial, and we want to make sure that, you know, we're focusing that, like we said with the SCOSA report, that, you know, that your long-term financial plan, your business plans, asset management plans and your budget all align, but then that it's also doing what we say we're going to do. Yep, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the nuance, or what we're trying to work through now, is reputation. The conversations that we're having, I mean, obviously it's a given, but what did we actually do to measure it previously? Financial ratios are easy to be able to. I'm sorry, Sharon, I don't mean they're easy. The job's not easy. I'm saying they're tangible. You can move them around, and you can get that. You can get those ratios looking the way that Sharon's trying to wordsmith up right now. But when we talk about reputational risk, how do you quantify that? Do you quantify that with all the annoyed Facebook comments that you get? Probably not. Or do you? You know, do you quantify that with customer satisfaction? Well, yes, to a degree. And what tools do you have to measure that? You know, we have a community scorecard that we utilise to capture that data, but the data isn't old enough to plot trends either. So yes, it's a weird sort of position we're in. When we talk about the strategy, that this is, you know, year one of our new strategy, and this is how we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole, in lack of a better term. I think where we need to make sure that we're clear as well is, yes, using simple language, absolutely, because not everyone speaks business management, or, you know, strategic management, or project management, or, you know, operational management, or all those terms. But I think we need clear KPIs and measures. So when we do get to the end of a budget cycle, we know what we've got as a bang on. You know, we look at it in estimating when we're estimating for millions of dollars worth of projects, and we want our estimators, which I'm also an estimator as well, we want to make sure you're within 5%. Whether or not you're over or under doesn't actually matter, because the reality is that the loss or the win needs to be, you need to figure out why that happened. So you can either mimic it or not mimic it. Yeah. And that's as simple as it gets. So when we talk about a budget that we forecast our overs and unders for one budget cycle for our greater goal, but we're not going back and looking at our overs and unders efficiently enough to capture that data, you can see how it's pretty easy to slip on your long-term financial plan. It almost becomes overwhelming, because it's just like, oh, what did we say it was last year? Oh, you know what? And consistently that revenue income seemed, you know, when you compare it to other councils' long-term financial plan, I actually managed to almost plot a bit of a trend that I couldn't unsee. And it was, oh yeah, we'll just allow a $1.5 to $2 million revenue increase each year for the next 10, and then that'll set up my spreadsheet. And it was just too consistent across comparable councils. The only one that stuck out was Mount Barker, which is one of those growth councils, right? And obviously they were up at the 5 million sort of forecast. Oh, good, you know, they must be thinking about what they're doing. Whether or not they get everything right, let's put that table that for a second. But the consistency of what I was noticing across long-term financial plans through local government, if our long-term financial plan and our strategic documents are our business plans, then they have measurable outcomes and you reach them or you don't. You don't back engineer just to make the figures work.
Yeah.
So that's, some of those KPIs and measures that if we're gonna do this and we're gonna set up this strategy, we need to make sure that we're clear, that we're meeting our targets in plain English. So when we get to the end of it, that was a good idea or it was a bad idea. Either way, it doesn't matter. We need to make sure we don't keep on making the same mistakes or we mimic the same wins.
Yeah, and that's that closing the loop and doing
Yeah.
the lessons learned exercise.
Absolutely.
Part of your,
And that goes back to the quality improvement and it goes back to an international standard that a lot of companies apply.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. All right, so we've got some revised wording. Do you want to just push it down? That's it. Cool. So, Christine, are you happy with that and everybody else?
Yeah, I was just trying to summarise the discussion of the last nearly 2 hours.
Noted. All right, so does everybody just have a quick look at that? Budget, recommends future reports include reference to the audit. Yeah, no, I think that captures everything. Does anyone else want anything else added, changed? No? Okay. Do I have a mover? Christine's going to move it. Seconder? Mayor Redmond seconding. All in favour? Carried unanimously. All right. So, item 6 with items listed for discussion. Don't have any. 7 is items listed for discussion at future meetings. Don't have any. 8 is, sorry.
In that particular point, do we actually put in there a risk appetite conversation to flow through? So we touch on it each meeting, see where we're at.
Okay, yeah, if you're...
only if the room is happy with it.
Everyone happy with that? So review...
Yeah, just items listed
Okay,
for discussion in the future.
For
So
future meetings, so yeah.
risk appetite.
Include risk appetite. Yep, that's enough, isn't it? Yeah, cool. So number 8 is questions without notice. None. Item 9 is motions without notice. None. And so therefore, we'll say the meeting is closed at 8:58. For 9 o'clock. Yes. Oh, do you want to?
Yeah.
And with our next meeting's the 7th of May.
I'll be an apology, yes.
Oh, you're somewhere exciting.
Chile and Argentina. Might spend more time in Chile rather than Argentina.
Lucky.
I've been teaching myself the last 6 months.